Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. Bishop Jane will be known to a great many of you, and Bishop Jane has experience before her life as a bishop as an archdeacon in the Diocese of Southwark. And Bishop Jane will be reflecting on a number of things, and one of them will be the perspective shift of moving from a very urban London diocese to a quite rural East Anglian diocese. So we look forward to what you have to say to us, Bishop Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the first question is, am I going to irritate the vicar because I haven't got the microphone in the right place? Is this all right? Thank you very much. Good. First test passed. Yes, the first change from moving from southeast London to rural northwest Norfolk was, where is everybody? My husband and I spent the first 3 weeks in Dereham wondering where everybody was, and then we realised that was everybody. And after that, it's been all right. Anyway, this church where we gather this morning is, I think, a fine example of the topic of our conference, Community Changemakers. The community whose church this is changed it. The church building is both a witness to how communities change and a witness to how the church changes in response to the changes in the community. And I hope that the very fact that we're all seated here today means that it is in itself an encouragement to us to continue to be communities of change. And I don't underestimate how hard that is. My favourite theologian, call this sad, but there you go, is a chap called Richard Hooker, who lived in the 16th century. He was really, if you want a theologian to explain what the theology of the Church of England is, Hooker's your man. 5 volumes of it, great if you can't sleep. But the opening sentence of his book is, "Change is never made without inconvenience, even from worse to better." I think that's quite an encouragement to us as Anglicans. It's always inconvenient to change, but it can be from worse to better. So how has this church changed? It, or at least its tower, is Norman. It's one of the oldest Norman round towers in Norfolk, so let's say 11th century. The church, bar the tower, was rebuilt, notice, in the 14th century. The chancel was, I'm banging here, have I got it too close? Yeah, let's try and take it down a bit, keep you all awake, but a bit irritating. Dear, sorry about this. Right, let's try that. The church, bar the tower, was rebuilt, notice, in the 14th century. The chancel was then demolished sometime between 1740 and 1830 with a license, we would say a faculty, they were very law-abiding folks. After a major storm, they took it all down and tried to replace it with a gable. And pretty much everything we see today, except for the tower, which is much older, and the remarkable technology we're using, which is of course much newer, is Victorian. But if that's how the church has changed, what about the community? The Domesday Book recorded the population of Haveringland in 1086, so about the same time as the tower, as 22 households. Believe it or not, that put the village in the largest 40% of villages across the country recorded in the Domesday Book, which tells you something about populations back then. As far as I can tell, the population then rose and reached its height in the mid-19th century at 200 persons. So we've never been talking a huge metropolis here. By 1911, the population declined to about 100, and I assume it declined further when Haveringland Hall was demolished to make way for RAF Swannington. Today, proving that you can't keep a good Norfolk village down, Haveringland has a population of over 300, and it's that community with able leadership, which has enabled this church, now surrounded by fields, a horse sanctuary, and yes, all right, an airstrip, but we won't worry about that, to be in fantastic condition, loved by the village, and used regularly for worship. I tell you all this to give you some context to the areas I'd like us to consider in the next half an hour or so. And these are, let me just make sure I don't go on too long, parish, place, presence, and perseverance. So first of all, parish. Parish is a concept even older than the Domesday Book, older than our Norman Tower. From the time of the Council of Hertford in 672, the Church developed a system of describing how to give its clergy, and particularly its diocesan bishops, oversight and jurisdiction over particular areas. And this is the basis of the parish system. It was applied to the whole country, which was an unusual step for those days, because at that time, as you remember from school history, England was not a unified country. We were a composite of give or take 7 kingdoms. But the system obviously commended itself for church and then for civil purposes, and although it's been amended over time and the boundaries have changed, here we still are. The parish remains the smallest unit of civil governance until we have yet another reorganisation, but anyway. And it applies across the majority of the country, ecclesiastical and civil. But for the Church of England, the parish was then, and is now, much more than a unit of governance. It is a place where heaven and earth meet in its central focus, which is the parish church. And even more than this, Andrew Rumsey, in his very good and much shorter than Hooker book, Parish and Anglican Theology of Place, makes the point that when the New Testament uses the word which we translate stranger, the Greek word is paroikia, the word from which we get parish. In that sense, the church in the first centuries was the gathered community of those who didn't really belong anywhere else. Mostly, they weren't the important citizens, they lived outside the city walls, they were slaves often without legal personality in their own right. They were, even if they were freeborn citizens, suspect, because they had been chosen to be outside the then dominant structure of the worship of the pagan gods, and especially offering incense to the emperor. They were the paroikia, the strangers, the oddities, the outsiders. And they were also those who were gathered into one body in Christ, who would later bring the Christian civic and the Christian sacred into one community, one place, one parish, and as I have said, one parish church. So if this is what a parish is, and if the parish church is its focus, both of community and of the sacred, of prayer and of worship, what does that tell us about my second point, about place? Well, if nothing else, it tells us that place matters. The work done on this building has, I suspect, been transformative for the village. Things happen now that didn't happen before. And it was done with the explicit intention of giving the church back to the village, and indeed to the airmen, their successors and families, whose lives and history are so associated with it. And whenever we embark on church projects, I think the why is always vital. And that element of gift in this project, of giving back, of allowing something new to bubble up, not only for the church community, but for other people, seems to me to be hugely important. Place is also important because Christian theology is not a theology of the disembodied, the merely spiritual. What we do, who we are, and where we are in this world matters. The world is, after all, a divine creation. God reached out to the lost and the foundering humanity, not in a ray of light, but as in a person, a human being, who lived on earth and walked among us and went about in a particular place. His presence transformed that place as it transformed the people with whom he had to do. And this is our calling today as Christian parishioners. We are agents of change, agents of transformation in the place in which we are set. Place is, of course, geography, because geography is history. And in the geography of a place, we find not only its secular history, but also its sacred history. How has the body of Christ, those odd people outside the walls, that unconnected group of strangers, changed this place for the better? This story, which is often recorded in parish churches, is the story of the Christian parishioners, those beyond the wall dwellers. As the centuries come and go, the overlap of the sacred story and the secular and the civic story also comes and goes, so that the story varies over time, but at its heart, always, are the motives and the values which come from being in Christ. And as we consider it today, I find it really heartening that some of our churches, like this one, find themselves in the position of those early Christians, outside the city walls, almost outcasts from the villages that they serve. For this we could, and often do, lament after hundreds of years of building our churches in the centre of their communities. But we could also see it as a sign of God recalling us to our primary Christian identity, to be one in Christ, built into a spiritual temple by him, even while our Christian calling to service and transformation is offered both on the edges and from the edges, as well as at the heart of the communities we seek to serve. I find this genuinely helpful in reminding us both of our calling to transformation and of the ebb and flow of the church's place in civic life. Many of us, many of you, labour in fundraising, care of buildings, keeping the show on the road, and the fundraising and the buildings are important, of course they are. But the question, as I suggested earlier, is why are they? And I submit that they are important, not because we are a heritage organisation. Indeed, with respect to those of you who are specifically heritage here today, I would suggest that as Christians, we've lost the plot if we've become just a group of people who care about the building and happen to meet at a certain time on certain Sundays to sing a few old-fashioned songs that nobody else knows anymore. The buildings are important because in the prayer and the worship that's offered there, we rediscover who we are as the parochia, the outsiders. Now, not necessarily because we are social outcasts, but in the sense that we do not see the world through the same lens as many of those with whom we live and work, those who do not have our faith, those who see the world through different lenses and take a different perspective. I'll try and say a bit more about that when I come to perseverance. But first, let me do what I was briefed to do in this session and talk a bit more about the differences between our rural and my previous, more urban context. As Andrew has said, I came here from the Diocese of Southwark, where I had for 8 years been the Archdeacon of Southwark, not, mercifully, the whole diocese, which would have been a terrible punishment, but of its urban heartland, that triangle of land which stretches along the south bank of the Thames from Blackfriars Bridge, beyond Tower Bridge to Deptford, and then down through Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, Camberwell, Kennington, Walworth and Peckham, and down into Dulwich, which was my smart bit. To give you some idea of the difference between this and rural Norfolk, Southwark, just that patch I've described, covered an area of slightly over 11 square miles and had a population of 315,000 people when I left. The Archdeaconry of Lynn, on the other hand, covers an area of around 800 square miles and has a population of 2,350 people. Or in average terms, my Southwark Archdeaconry had 9,000 people per square mile, and the area I try to look after as Bishop of Lynn has about 900 people per square mile. You can understand why I was looking for everyone. Heritage in the Archdeaconry of Southwark, which was a problem which was largely solved by the Air Force that the gallant airmen commemorated in this church sought to defend us from. The first German bombs took out the parish church of Holy Trinity in Rotherhithe, which makes you, they did so because they thought it was an armaments factory, which makes you wonder if it was such a heritage loss after all. Anyway, and so it continued throughout the Blitz. Some of the churches were rebuilt, but very, very many were not. Housing needs were acute, and the building energy went into those, but as well, the population declined after the war and continued to do so until the 1980s. None of this meant, I regret to say, that the churches which were newly built were any easier to maintain. Jerry building abounded. British building between the 1960s and the 1980s was not at its best. And I regret, and am glad to say, that I saw more Budleyers thriving in church gutters and mortar in southeast London than I've ever seen in rural Norfolk. So congratulations on maintaining your churches extremely well. But where Southwark and Norfolk overlap and this slightly surprised me, is in the importance of place and the power of the church to transform that place, which is a matter for my third point about presence. The continued presence of the churches, whether in decent buildings or not, affected continual transformation in two ways. The first, which you might reasonably expect, lay in the loyalty of those who had grown up in the urban parishes, those who had been to Sunday school in those churches, who had been baptized there, been to youth group, confirmation, had been married there, and expected to have their funeral there. They continued to attend, and in many cases, out of their obviously continuing concern, came some of the really transformational church action and social action of the parish in the post-war period. Youth ministry, food banks, after-school clubs, and so on. In many cases, in areas of significant deprivation. Some of this was not unconnected to that mixed bag of heady Christian upset of the 1960s, which was South Bank religion. Some of it came out of the 1960 Albemarle report, which built youth centres, established a national training centre for youth workers, and addressed how young people, boys and girls, could find their place and contribute to their community in a vastly changed post-war environment. And much of it continues to this day. Some of the youth centres were still operative, and of course the social need continued. So with the food banks, the youth clubs, and the after-school clubs, and so on. That concern for young people and the loyalty of the parishioners to their parishes, I see here in Norfolk too, although in very different social and economic circumstances. Let me highlight three of those for you, which make the purpose of the presence of the church to be and to bring much needed transformation different, but nevertheless analogous. And this is to do with social class and social change, the size of population, and the homogeneity or diversity of population. South East London, which was where I was born and lived until I went to university, was largely the part in which I grew up and then ministered, working class. Many of my forebears would have been described in that social bracket, and believe you me, they would as soon have gone to church regularly on a Sunday as they would have gone to the moon. Church wasn't for people like us. This isn't to say that church and religion didn't matter. They did. Sunday observance most certainly mattered when I was small. And for those you can hark back to the days when if you ran out of milk on a Saturday evening, that was it until Monday morning. That was very much a part of the childhood in which I grew up. And it was enforced at home for me and my school friends. Church mattered for weddings, for baptism, although by the time I was born and growing up, probably less for funerals. But regular Sunday church just was not a thing. That wasn't true of all working class people, and the more inner urban you got, the more working class people did go to church. But generally, church was not for the blue-collared. And I have not found that here in such overwhelming strength as I found back there. I don't mean that every single member of our parishes flocks to church every Sunday, if only. But I think the fact that people don't go to church here is often a matter of social change rather than a matter of social class. I may be wrong there, but that's my observation. I just think it's slightly different. Then secondly, the size of the population. The numbers I gave you earlier, not to mention the experience of travelling in Norfolk, tells you that there are far fewer people here. And as a result of that, I think it's much harder here to be poor and for the churches to address poverty than it was in my old archdeaconry. For most of the time I was there, poverty was normal. Park Dulwich, although even in parts of Dulwich, but Dulwich apart, most housing was social housing, most employment was low paid. No one liked it, but it was normal, probably generational, and there was no shame in it. Consequently, at least I think consequently, there was also the most amazing generosity. One of my most moving memories was of a diocesan synod when not for the first or the last time the diocese was running out of money, is of a white working class man standing up to speak, jingling his change in his pocket, and telling the synod that if many of the men of his acquaintance dropped a pound coin on the floor of the pub of an evening, they'd not always stoop, or perhaps by that stage were not able to stoop, to pick it up. So he said, everyone can afford an extra pound, and if everyone gave an extra pound to the church, wouldn't that be a good start? If you're not used to having, bizarrely it seemed, you were less inclined to hang on to what you did have. And I don't think either of those things is quite true here. I think to be poor in rural Norfolk is really, really hard. You are much more isolated. You're safer, but you're much more isolated. There is not frequent, cheap public transport. There aren't easy things to walk to. There isn't an abundance of cheap shop. There isn't a whole... Oh dear, have I said something wrong? I hope that was a thing, not a person. Excellent. Was it? Have we killed anyone? I hope not. Are you all right? Please don't throw yourself... If you don't like what I say, just tell me. Don't throw yourself on the floor. Please, please. There aren't cheap shops. There isn't lots that you can walk to, and everybody else around you isn't living in the same circumstances in quite the same way. And I wonder if that has a knock-on effect on our giving. I think that possibly combined with the fact that the German Air Force did not bomb us quite so comprehensively, so we have heritage duties, if you like, that South East London doesn't have. But our giving is much lower than the national average, and I wonder if it is something to do with our social, economic, and for want of a better word, heritage circumstances. And then thirdly, on homogeneity. In ethnic terms, we are not a diverse diocese. We're getting more so, and we are diverse in other ways. And this is changing, but what we haven't seen are the waves of immigration, which truthfully have kept the Church of England and quite a lot of the Roman Catholic Church in urban areas alive, as well as seeing the rise of many new Pentecostal churches. I do think we see this in some of our urban centres, Norwich, King's Lynn, to some extent Great Yarmouth, but not generally across the county. When I first went to Southwark 25 years ago, the majority of the area of which I would later be Archdeacon was by background Afro-Caribbean and rural. On my first visit to a church in the Elephant and Castle of all places, I was given seed money, because that's what you gave a priest when the priest first came to church. It was a deeply rural culture, despite being, frankly, in the middle of a roundabout. By the time I became Archdeacon 13 years later, the majority population was West African, and again, rural. And when I left 5 years ago, the second language of the borough of Southwark had become Spanish, and our new immigrants, our new parochia, were Latino, and yes, rural. We just don't see that continued churn here. In more rural areas, we just don't see continued waves of new people coming in from countries where there is already a strong Anglican tradition or a strong tradition of church going. We are seeing a lot of house building and a lot of white people moving in, but they are people for whom the habit of church going has largely died. So what do? I think we have to go with what we've got. We have to emphasize the importance of what the church can do for community. So where people have no local connection, can we offer them something? People's children have needs. What can we do for children? What can we do with Bubble Church? What can we do with the occasional events, Christmas, Easter, and others, to which people will come? What can we do to build community as a church so that we are the change makers which enables real community to develop? Our churches can be, and in my view should be, public spaces. They're not public spaces for anything goes, and they never have been. Back in the medieval period, people were building what they then called church houses because they didn't want the less respectable things happening in church. But there are plenty of respectable things that can happen in northwest Norfolk that can happen in church, as this church as an example of. In all these ups and downs, in urban and in rural areas, church can offer, despite its need to help communities change, a stable foundation. Going back to Southeast London, the Eucharist in Ghana isn't common worship, but you know where you are as soon as you start the service. If you're Latino, many of the higher Anglican churches in my archdeaconry were pretty much like what they had known at home, and we were fortunate in being able to appoint a Spanish-speaking priest. So illegally, but we won't mention that, we translated common worship and had common worship in Spanish one service and English the next. If we don't have those continuing waves of new population, though, if we go with what we've got, if we strive as communities to enable our churches to adapt to the communities around us, if we try to grow younger, not by filling our churches with teenagers whom we haven't got, but by dropping the average age of some of our congregations to 60 to 70 rather than 80 to 90, we're all going in the right direction. God has called us to be people in these places with a purpose. And we go with what we've got in the parishes and the places which we are called to be present. And that brings me to my final point, which is about perseverance. In technical theological language, perseverance is a grace. The grace by which we are enabled, as Matthew 10:22 has it, to persevere to the end. It is the grace to remain faithful, the grace given through prayer, by which hope does not die, the virtue by which we continue in the faith, in the service of God, and the service of the church. It probably doesn't sound very glamorous, and truthfully, I don't suppose it is. The grace of final perseverance is the grace by which we are ultimately brought into the presence of God and experience the beatific vision, a grace which no human being is worthy to attain and which we could never reach by our own efforts. But on a more day-to-day basis, the grace of perseverance is the grace by which we keep on showing up. It is the grace by which we continue to pray, to be open to the Lord, showing new and unexpected ways for his church to be. Who would have thought 20 years ago that 100 of us would be in this community, in this church, having this conversation now? And for the purposes of the last few minutes of this address, let me link that perseverance with the community of saints. I said earlier that I would say a little bit more about being the parochia, the ones who see the world through a different lens. And at this point, I want to say a bit more about South Bank religion, this time to part company from it. In the form of Honest to God by John Robinson, sometime Bishop of Woolwich, South Bank religion rejected God as an old man in the sky, good so far, parted company with God out there at all, arguably rather less good, and suggested that God should be understood as the ground of our being. Not bad, but something we haven't really got time to go into now. But the effect in the popular press and in the public mind was almost akin to the death of God. And I mention this because I want to bring my urban and rural experience back together now, not to contrast them, but to speak of their similarity, which I believe lies in the communion of saints. The communion of saints is what the Book of Common Prayer's post-communion prayer calls the blessed company of all faithful people. Living and departed, we are one with all the saints, and we, just as they, find our fullest joy in the praise and the service of God. And so, in Norfolk, we have churchyards. You didn't have churchyards in South East London. And one of the more surprising experiences I had when first ministering here in rural Norfolk was listening to people telling me where they would be buried. People in full health, I hasten to add, that they would be buried in the same churchyard that their parents and their grandparents and even generations before that had been buried. There was a biblical ring about this. For you remember how in the Old Testament we read of David and others being gathered to his fathers. And it resonated with my urban experience. This time, it wasn't because immigrant congregations expected to be buried in the churchyards of South East London. London burials had been a thing of the past for over 100 years. but because the misery of a death was always accompanied by the expense of repatriating a body so that it could be gathered to the fathers, buried with Christians of previous generations in the right place at the right time for the resurrection with the paroikia with whom that Christian had belonged. Every time I walk through a country churchyard, I remember this. I remember the myriad Christians who have gone before us, with whom we are the community of saints, who had the grace of perseverance, and I am encouraged and comforted. They saw the church have its ups and downs, even as we do. They saw their communities change, even as we do. And they saw the effects of mutual change, churches changing communities, communities changing church. And here we still are. In many ways, Haveringland has done something amazing with this church. And in other ways, it has just written the next chapter of a long book of community and church and change-making. I don't know what will come next in any of our rural churches, but I do believe that by the grace of God, it will be good. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bishop Jane. Fascinating insights and a wonderfully different perspective. I wonder if there are any questions, comments, or observations from the floor. We have a few minutes before our next panel discussion is due to start. So if you've been holding on to a question that you think you might like to ask Bishop Jane, or a complaint. Stunned into silence.
Thank you. Sorry, I'd just like to say what an inspirational talk, and thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Similarly, I'd like to say I wish it was broadcast to all the congregations and the villages in Norfolk, because if they heard your views, many more might help us transform everything.
I hope so. Well, if we can send them, we can put the link maybe in the next e-news.
Yep, we can
Get
share
it
the
out
YouTube
there,
link.
the YouTube thing,
Certainly.
so people can pick it up.
Stephen.
I'm going to sound like the girly swat. Could we have again the name of the theologian that you mentioned? I've taken my glasses off now.
So there are two.
It was Parish and Anglican Theology.
Yes, it was Andrew Rumsey, who's about to be the Bishop of St Albans, R-U-M-S-E-Y. He was Vicar of Gypsy Hill in good old South East London, and it's called Parish and Anglican Theology of Place. And he's written two other books after that, one of which is called English Grounds, which is a lovely book. It's a series of basically short one-page essays. I've never understood how he had time to do this. I keep resolving to do it myself. On his way between A and B, he would call into one of his rural churches when he was in the Diocese of Salisbury and just write a bit about it. And he's a beautiful, quite poetic writer. But An Anglican Theology of Place is the one you want.
Do we have any more questions?
And if you can't go to sleep with that one, try Richard Hooker.
Okay, well, thank you, Bishop Jane. Wonderful to have you with us this morning. And Bishop Jane will be with us through the day and is part of the next panel. And that takes me on to panel discussions. We split at this point in two. And your piece of paper in your pocket will tell you where you're going, either remaining here in the church or going through to the marquee. If you're going through to the marquee, zip your coat up. Might be a bit chilly out there. So, transforming mission in rural churches will be in the marquee, and transforming communities will be here in about 4 minutes.